Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Father Thomas Crean. He has recently written a book titled Integralism with his co-author. I would say that the book has caught a lot of attention, especially because a lot of people, they're not familiar with the word integralism, or when they heard the thesis of the book, they thought it was like Catholic monarchy returning or something like that. So I think a lot of the episode today is just going to be clarification, defense, and really a substantive philosophical dialogue. So, Father Thomas, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, certainly. So I am an English Dominican, and I was ordained as a priest in 2001, and I've had a variety of academic and pastoral roles over the years since then. And as you've just heard, I co-authored a book called Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy, with a friend of mine, and that came out a few months ago.
Is it pronounced, so can I say integralism or is it integralism?
Oh, well, that's one of the great debates, and I've never heard an authoritative ruling. But I say integralism, but that may just be the bad English custom of stressing polysyllables very early, so you end up swallowing lots of the following syllables. I think that's an English custom.
Well, hopefully it's a forgivable difference for our conversation today. So just to start off then, can you define what integralism is for us and kind of unpack too what commitments come with this? So are there any moral, religious, or metaphysical commitments that underpin this vision?
Yes, certainly. Well, of course, definitions are free, so people could use it in various ways. The way we understand it is as a certain doctrine about the relation of what are called the temporal and the spiritual power. So by the temporal, spiritual, and by the temporal power, we mean those who exercise the executive and judicial and legislative power in our civil societies. And by the spiritual power, we mean the Pope and the bishops. And I'd say that integralism is a doctrine that holds that these two kinds of power, the temporal and the spiritual, are by nature or are by design of God, distinct but hierarchically united. So that would be my short summary, that these powers are distinct but hierarchically united. And as far as my fellow author, Alan Fimister, and I are concerned, integralism is just a technical name for the Catholic doctrine in a particular area of doctrine. So just for what we would claim is the orthodox position in this particular area. So in a sense, I would say there shouldn't be integralist Catholics and non-integralist Catholics, just like there shouldn't be Trinitarian Catholics, non-Trinitarian Catholics, or iconodual Catholics and iconoclast Catholics. So I just, as iconodulia is a technical name for the Catholic view of icons, that they should be revered in virtue of the saint to whom they refer. So I would say that integralism is just the Catholic view of how the temporal and the spiritual powers should relate. So obviously there are massive religious and moral presuppositions behind this book. I suppose the most important one is to point out that most important presupposition is that not only is the Catholic faith true, but that it can be known to be true. So it's the Catholic view of faith is that it is a light that confers certainty, and therefore it is rational for people to act on that certainty, not only in their private life, but also in public law and public policy. And so when there is a population that is sufficiently Catholic, and when there is enough Catholics in it and they are sufficiently committed to the Catholic faith, then it makes sense. And in fact, it is, we argue, an obligation for the spiritual and temporal power to be united in this hierarchical and distinct way.
Before we continue, I think someone might wonder, well, Father Thomas, that's just your opinion, right? And they'll say, well, but I have my opinion, you have your opinion. Why are you so sure that the Catholic faith is true? And it can become so true that it becomes part of the political fabric in some sense.
Well, I mean, that question could mean a number of things. That could be a biographical question to me about why I
Mm.
happen to be a Catholic, or it could be a more abstract question about what are the grounds of the faith in itself. And so the Catholic position is that the faith is a rational act. Um, it's a rather subtle position, the Catholic position, because we hold, first of all, that the reasons for belief can be demonstrated. That's to say, it can be rationally demonstrated that one should assent to the Catholic faith by looking at the gospel simply considered as a historical document, and by looking at philosophical arguments and historical arguments and so on, that a rational case can be made from all those various sources. But nevertheless, the act of faith itself, according to Catholic theology, depends upon the gift of faith, which is a supernatural light infused into the intellect. And according to Catholic doctrine, this does grant a rational certainty, which is in fact greater than any natural certainty.
Mm.
And that's the answer about why, according to Catholic doctrine, it is rational for the Catholic faith to be made the basis of social order.
All right. So moving on then to the next question. You refer to integralism as the middle way between two extremes, these extremes being secularism and theocracy. So I'm interested in what sense is integralism a middle way?
Yes, I can't remember if we use that phrase in the book, but certainly I can make a sense out of it. I mean, theocracy can be used the word can be said in many ways, and lots of people, especially people who don't like the book, would say, "Oh, that is theocracy, surely." And you could use the word theocracy in that way if you wanted to, but I would understand it being a middle way in this sense, that we recognize the existence of two powers, a temporal power and a spiritual power. And these are really distinct, and one should not usurp the province of the other. So the Pope should not usurp the province of a political ruler, and nor should the political ruler usurp the province of the Pope or the bishops. So I suppose one kind of theocracy would be where you just didn't admit there was any reason to have distinct bearers of these two powers, and you just said the clergy should be in charge of everything. The clergy should determine the tax rates, and they should lead the armies and decide where the roads and hospitals are built, and so on. And that would be a dreadful society, but it would be a conceivable one. And the other alternative, the other extreme rather, is the secular version. Now, in extreme form, I suppose you'd say that only admits the existence of the temporal power. So something like Soviet Russia or French or revolutionary France in the 1790s, where Catholic hierarchy was suppressed. In a less extreme form, secularism appears to admit the existence of the spiritual power, but it actually subordinates it to the temporal power. And so you in that sense, you still have a hierarchical subordination, but it's the other way around from what the Catholic view is. So in the Catholic view, the temporal is ultimately subordinate to the spiritual. In the secular view, the spiritual is subordinate to the secular. And so the bishops or the priests might want to take a relevant example. They might want to keep the churches open, but it's ultimately the government that decides if people can go to church or not. And that would be an example of the secular being subordinating the spiritual to itself.
Or like another example, the government deciding how Catholic adoption agencies are supposed to operate, or, Catholic
Exactly.
schools,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
All right. So, what would you say are the extremities then of secular liberalism, or where exactly does this vision go awry?
Well, it seems to me that secularism, liberalism, the two things are perhaps just different names for, or different, refer to different aspects of the same kind of polity. Uh, they really depend on the idea either that you can't know what the purpose of life is, or that you can know what the purpose of life is, and the purpose of life is maximizing freedom.
Yeah.
So either of those principles would be enough to justify the liberal regime, the secular regime. Um, uh, Obviously, I think that they're both flawed, because I hold that the purpose of life, both the ultimate purpose of life, which is supernatural according to Catholic theology, and is the goal for which the spiritual path exists, both that is knowable, and also we can know about the natural goal of life because we can have um, by reason alone, we can have a certain knowledge of human nature, which allows us to talk about a natural goal, even though that's only pursued well when it's being pursued in reference ultimately to the very final goal of nature,
Mm.
of man.
The final goal being God.
The final goal being the beatific vision, being
Yeah. Hmm.
vision of God in heaven. And so that's how things start in a way with liberalism. Now, Leo XIII made an interesting point, almost as a throwaway remark. I think it was either in Libertas or in Immortale Dei, one of his great encyclicals about social questions, and which he said that liberalism ultimately doesn't differ from atheism, and that strikes people sometimes as too severe, as if Leo was just sort of losing his temper. But I think there's a very profound reason behind that, because if you think that it's not possible to know what the purpose of life is with certainty, which is the liberal premise, with sufficient certainty for it to be the basis of law and policy, then it must follow that you think that God has not revealed the goal of life to us in a way that enables us to have certainty. But if that's the case, then God has not acted wisely or not acted well. So but a God who does not act wisely or well is obviously not God, and therefore there is no God uh, if it's not possible for man to be certain about his ends. So ultimately, I think Leo is right in what he said, that liberalism um, over the years has a tendency to turn into uh, atheism, and the liberal state has a tendency to turn into an aggressively anti-religious and atheist state.
And just to unpack on your latter definition of secular liberalism, liberalism, whatever we want to call it, um, the maximization of freedom. I mean, we could probably just couch this in terms of autonomy, like how the contemporary person thinks of
Mm.
autonomy is basically like Mill's harm principle, right? You can do whatever you want so long as you don't harm unconsenting third parties. Um, how would someone of the Catholic position respond to that, or a natural law background?
Mm-hmm. Well, Mill there is taking it for granted that there are certain things that we can know are harmful, such as having our arm chopped off, and therefore we should stop people doing it. And obviously, I agree with him on that point. And that there are other questions that we can't know if they're harmful or not. So we should just let everybody have perfect freedom. So we can't know whether it's harmful to go to mass uh, or to suppress the mass, or whether it's harmful to believe in the Trinity, or whether it's a good thing to believe in the Trinity. All these things are matters in Mill's view of personal opinion, and you can have your own opinion, but you cannot have a justified certainty. which is equivalent to your justified certainty that it's a bad thing for you to have your arm cut off. So it's a disagreement in, I suppose you might say, in epistemology before you get to the realm of political philosophy.
Yeah, and then just to make another point too, us as scholastics, right? We place metaphysics prior to epistemology. So could you unpack the relevance of that for why we talk about conferring certainty in a way, right? Because metaphysics is logically prior. In some sense, you have to be certain, or it's just almost self-evident in a way. Certain truths, right? When you discern the nature of reality and individuate it.
I'm not sure if I'm following you, if I'm seeing what point you're getting
So
at.
the
Can you
point
give me
that
some
I'm
more help on that?
sure. So then you were talking about like how there's a difference between our position and Mill's position, and it's epistemic in some sense, right? So do you have enough justified certainty
Mm-hmm.
to make this the position of public law or the social order, right? And then because we come from a tradition where metaphysics is prior to epistemology, and if the writings of Otterberg and I think even maybe St. Thomas, talking about how these are first principles of reality, so it's not the case that you can't be uncertain about them in some sense. Does that make sense? They're the first principles to make sense of everything else. So that's why in some sense we would say we would have justified certainty, because they are the first principles from which we're basing everything else from.
Yes, so the natural law, which according to this view according to the Catholic view, is written on the heart of man, gives us an irrefragable certainty about the goodness of certain kinds of action, and therefore about the evil of other kinds of action. So when St. Thomas is discussing the fundamental precepts of the natural law, one of the ones which he includes is that it is good for man to worship God, for example. And so he would see this as something that is known by natural reason, and therefore is rightly acted upon by those who are in positions of authority to prevent the spread of atheism, for example, within the state. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but that's
maybe
as close as I can come.
Let me try another way then, right? So and I'm hoping that I'm trying to be as clear as possible, right? But let's see here. For a lot of I think what I'm asking is just basically the scholastic methodology for how we approach these kinds of questions, right? So if you're someone who places epistemology first and then metaphysics is subordinate to that, then it's like, it's very likely that you can become very uncertain about a lot of things, right? But because as scholastics, we place metaphysics first, and that you have to have these first principles of reality from which you can make sense of everything else, right? Then our epistemology is not so subject to, let's say, counterexamples and all this uncertainty. Does that make sense? It's a methodological point about how we reason.
Yeah, so we certainly depend. This position certainly depends on the idea there is something called human nature,
Yeah.
and that human nature is knowable, and that there is such a thing as the natural law, which includes the goodness of worshipping God, the goodness of marriage and the family, the superiority of contemplation over action, the excellence of friendship when that's a virtuous friendship, distinction between a private and common good, the spirituality of the soul, and the fact that the spirituality of the soul means that we are capable of grasping spiritual goods, and that spiritual goods are common goods, and therefore they're the basis for a true society and true friendship. So I suppose those are all, they're all very substantial philosophical positions that,
Mm-hmm.
would certainly not be accepted by everyone, and that, yes, they're all presupposed to the the political philosophy that we're talking about here.
All right. So going back to that political philosophy, then, you described how the temporal powers have to be subordinate to the spiritual powers. So for some people, they might be wondering, well, what does that exactly mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
So could you kind of maybe give us a practical kind of, I don't know, unpacking of what that vision would look like, how it would manifest, just make it more clear for us what that means.
Yes. So right at the beginning of, as you know, at the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about this question of subordination, and explains that where there are goods that are subordinate to each other, then the arts that produce those goods are likewise subordinate. So I think his example is bridles being subordinate to horsemanship, or rather to horses, and so the art of bridle making being subordinate to um, um, the art of horsemanship. So what counts as a good bridle depends on what counts as on good horsemanship, and likewise horsemanship being subordinate to, at least in ancient Greek, to victory in war. So what counts as good horsemanship being subordinate to and being determined by what counts as a good military tactics. So it's the same idea as at work here, that what counts as a good earthly commonwealth depends on what counts as a happy eternity. Unless you know what happy eternity is, unless you know that it's the vision of God face to face, made available to us through the incarnation and the redemption, and through the sacraments. Unless you know that, then you don't know what a good earthly commonwealth would look like. So that's the very foundation of everything. And so the logical conclusion that, as Aristotelians would draw from that, is that the art of governing the temporal commonwealth well must in some sense be subordinate to the art of governing the spiritual commonwealth well. So how does that manifest itself? Well, in all kinds of ways, and the very sort of simple and I suppose relatively uncontroversial ways would be having a religious ceremony for installing a head of state, or having a judge installed, and the head of state and the judge promising to uphold the Catholic faith in their way of governing. Now, a more controversial way would be to say that when you have enough Catholics in society, so as to be able to do it without it causing massive social unrest, that the offices of legislators and judges, the executive offices, should be, as a rule, confined to Catholics, and that heresy or schism would be bars to public office. So that's really the situation that obtained in Christendom, medieval Christendom. So integralism just means really the principles that underlie Christendom, whether it's a medieval one or whether it's a future one. And therefore, again, if the possession of temporal power is dependent on professing Catholic faith, then that would mean that those who fall away from the faith or become schismatics, according to the judgment of the Church, would therefore be liable to be declared as having fallen from office. So that's what we would mean in practice by saying that the temporal power would be subject to the spiritual one. But what it wouldn't mean is to say that the spiritual power should be trying to do the job of the temporal power. To go back to what I was saying at the beginning, it wouldn't mean that the day-to-day decisions was something that the the Pope or the bishops had any right to pronounce upon, because in general the decisions that legislators and ministers have to make are ones for which the spiritual powers no particular competence to make. So we gave in our book the example of climate change. So let's say the Pope or the bishops of the day are convinced that there is a big problem with climate change and that certain action should be taken to deal with it. Well, they may be right or they may be wrong, but it's not a question that they've got any, as Pope or bishop, they've got any competence any more than anybody else to judge. And so it would be an abuse of power. It would be a kind of it would be a usurpation if they were to try to influence the decisions of the civil rulers in an area like that.
Yeah, so I'm already sensing that the point on, I kind of chuckled a little bit when you said, and now to a more controversial point, right? Because I was thinking about
Yes.
how a liberal might respond to the first point on, just the role of the religious, the public ceremony, right, of the installation of someone to public office, and then atop that, right, only someone who is a faithful professing Catholic, right, could be having public office. Could you talk about where that the second idea, right, that comes from your vision, right?
Well, I think it's not reasonable to expect non-Catholics to maintain a Catholic society. So if you really think that the most important thing in life is to get to heaven, and the way to do that is by following Christ according to the faith and sacraments of the Church, then you're going to want to have legislators and ministers who are going to think the same and who are going to therefore defend the faith and defend the Church. Now, if you don't believe that, then it's totally unreasonable for you to be expected to do that. So it all comes back to the question of whether the Catholic faith is something that can be knowable, can be known with certainty or not. And if you think it can, then I think the consequences follow logically. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that in this view that everyone else is an outlaw, or that it's open, that nobody else has any rights, because there are plenty of rights which we have by natural law, and which nobody can take away from us, whether we're Catholic or Buddhist or nothing at all. So, for example, the right to start a family, the right to own property, generally speaking, the right to move, the right to choose a career. All these things are matters of natural law, but I would claim there is no natural right to be eligible for Parliament or for the Senate or something like that, and so nobody suffers injustice in a given society if they don't have that right.
Also, just to kind of go off script again, some people might insist, well, Jesus was apolitical, right? Jesus didn't say anything about politics and social order. So they might accuse, right, your position of almost, let's say, not being Christ-like, if you will, right? I was wondering if you could touch on that then. What would Jesus say about your position?
Well, he said that all authority in heaven and on earth had been given to him. So that sounds to me as if a ruler that doesn't acknowledge Jesus Christ is failing to do his duty as a ruler. He'd be like a soldier in an army who didn't acknowledge the authority of his general, or like a captain or a lieutenant, or lieutenant, as you would say, who doesn't acknowledge the authority of the general. So that's one answer. So the kingship, what we call the kingship of Christ, is not simply Christ reigning in the soul of the believer, even though that is the most important thing and is the foundation for everything else. And without that, Christendom is just a hollow shell. But nevertheless, the kingship of Christ, even though it begins in the soul of the believer, rightly expands and is expressed in a visible way throughout society. Because we have and this is a key point, we have a duty to worship God not just as private individuals, but as people who are bound together in public, in society, because societies are not merely human creations, but they are creatures of God, because they're things that derive from natural law and therefore from the creator of nature. And so a temporal society, like a family, has got a duty as such to worship God. And to worship God correctly, we need to know how to do that. We need to be told how to do that. We can only worship God in the way that's acceptable to him by revelation. And of course, as a Catholic, I think that's through the incarnation of his Son and through the rites and sacraments of the Church. So that's one answer. That's one long answer. Another answer that we give in the book is reference to what we call the doctrine of the two swords. And so this is a rather little known passage but for most people probably, in St. Luke's Gospel, where Christ at the Last Supper, just before his passion, tells the apostles to sell their possessions if necessary in order to arm themselves with swords. And one of the disciples says, Lord, here are two swords. So they have two swords among them already. And Christ says to them, it is enough. And that's just a very little episode in the gospel, and apparently nothing else is made of it. But it becomes, in later Christian reflection, especially from the end of the first millennium and then throughout the Middle Ages, an important scriptural basis for the idea of Christendom. The idea being that these two swords are symbolic of the spiritual and the temporal power. And that both of these are in some way in the possession of the church, because the disciples have the two swords, even though they can't both be used by the same people. So generally speaking, the Pope and the bishops, as spiritual rulers, they don't have the right to exercise temporal power. And there's a bit of an exception to that for the Pope within the Papal States, but that's just an exception. So generally speaking, the church has the temporal sword, but it's not exercised by the clergy, because obviously the laity is as much part of the church as the clergy are, and the laity are the ones who have the temporal power. But both of these are powers within the church, and therefore, according to this interpretation of St. Luke's Gospel, it's part of the will of Christ that his church be furnished both with spiritual power and with temporal authority, not for its own sake, but in order to serve the salvation of souls.
All right. So moving on then from that objection, let's see here. There's like about 4 questions and then 2 objections and then a final question. So we can run down these maybe quite quickly. So I noticed that in one of your chapters, it was the chapter on the 2 cities. I noticed that you mentioned the devil, and I was wondering what's the devil's role in all of this, right? If you could unpack that, because I thought it was quite interesting to see. Usually the devil doesn't appear in books about political philosophy.
That's probably the way he likes it. Well, I think the devil is interested in politics. One reason is that if something can be declared legal, then people will very quickly come to believe that it's moral. We've seen this in the past few decades, for example, with homosexual activity. So obviously it would be in the devil's interest to try to pervert the laws of the country in order to try to harm the souls of the citizens. And another way of thinking about it, and this is what gave the title to that chapter that you're mentioning, is that there are these two cities that are spoken of by St. Augustine, but it's really the vision of the Book of the Apocalypse, that the history is about this combat between two cities, two armies, and that this is not just a metaphor, but that it's really describing what's going on at the deepest level. That there really is a fallen spirit who is a very powerful and who is trying to engineer the largest possible revolt of mankind against the Creator. So that's what the devil is interested in doing. And obviously, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is the head of what we call the city of God. So this comes from St. Augustine, but it's fleshed out by St. Thomas, and again, Leo XIII makes use of these ideas in his encyclical Humanum Genus. So that's how the devil comes in. I don't know if that's enough.
No, that's totally fine. So there's, I mean, this is kind of a Protestant term, but spiritual warfare, right, going on underneath the surface. And then in reflecting the city of God in some sense, right, trying to reflect the social kingship of Christ, as you put it, right? We're trying to subvert that power of the devil over, human societies and the human soul.
Yeah, so I see Christendom as well as being a duty of honor that is paid to Christ, as also being a protection for Christians. So there's no neutral space, and if there is some area of life in which we don't admit Christ's sovereignty, then by default the devil will gain some power over that area of life, and that would actually be a just sentence, or at least a just penalty that we would suffer. Yeah, so if we try to deny that Christ has a right to reign in the political sphere, then it's just as a penalty for that act of unfaithfulness that the devil will be allowed by God to gain a greater power in the political sphere. And we certainly don't want that to happen. So just as a matter of self-interest, even if you didn't know that it was a duty, even as a matter of self-interest, I think you'd be well advised to desire the restoration of Christendom.
If you don't mind, I was thinking about also bringing in kind of another controversial question. So what are your thoughts on heretics? So should we burn them at the stake, or, I mean, what do we do with the heretics?
Well, we should preach the truth and try to get them to convert. Now, in Christendom, where the bond of union is the Catholic faith, then the person who knowingly rejects that can't be a citizen, because they're rejecting the principle of unity of that society. What happens to them is a matter for they're subject, like any baptized person, they're subject to twofold authority. They're subject to the authority of the church in its spiritual rulers, and they're subject to the temporal rulers as well. So, and each of those rulers, the bishops and the government, to use a modern phrase, they have the duty to protect their society, and they have a certain range of penalties at their disposal. And the bishop's church, the spiritual power of the church, doesn't have the death penalty at its disposal, because that's not something that is fitting. It's not fitting that the clergy should be the direct cause of the shedding of blood. Historically, the spiritual penalties, or the penalties administered by the spiritual arm, have included all kinds of things, including imprisonment, and then fines, and then spiritual penalties like excommunication and denial of the Christian burial. Whereas the temporal rulers have stronger penalties at their disposal, so normally something like imprisonment, and then even capital punishment is at their disposal. Now, I don't see how you can rule out capital punishment for treason for someone who is determined to undermine a given society. So in Christendom, if someone is genuinely trying to destroy the Catholic faith in as many people's minds as he can, and if he can't be prevented, or if that category of offense can't be prevented any other way than by capital punishment, then I think that the temporal power would have the right to do that. Obviously, I hope that that would never happen.
All right. So now to go into some lighter topics. I guess we can combine these two questions together, because I noticed that throughout your book, and I mean, especially in the interviews that you've done on the book, you've talked about the real importance of the family, right? And how it is the fundamental unit of society and, you know, so forth. A lot of people, especially from a liberal tradition, will focus more on the individual and not see the family as the fundamental unit. So I was wondering if you could touch on why the family is the fundamental unit, how it shapes one's political philosophy. And then second, if you could talk about property rights on your view, right? So what are the scope and foundation of property rights? So the family and property.
Yes, so the family is unlike other societies, using the word society in the widest possible sense, because the family precedes civil society. So in that sense, it's unlike, say, a trade union or a chess club or a university, because before you can be a citizen, you first have to exist. And the family is the society which makes you exist. So the family is older than civil society, and therefore it has laws, has structure which is not dictated by civil society, but rather it's dictated by natural law. So the fact that the father is the head of the household, that the parents have the right to raise the children. And so the family retains these laws and this structure when it comes to be united with others in civil society. So that's the opposite, I would say, of what you, as you're saying, the opposite of the social contract theory, which makes the individual the unit. Because on that view, then the family, on the social contract view of society, where people are only individuals and they unite themselves supposedly to create a civil society, then the family is not recognized as having any laws which are independent of human choice. So the family just then becomes one of the many societies that people can choose to create and structure as they want. So it becomes like the family becomes like a tightly knit workers' cooperative with unusual sleeping arrangements. Whereas, and if you take that view, it seems to be inevitable that you end up thinking of authority as being vested by the individual choices in the state, and then any other authority is delegated by the state, maybe to a family, maybe to a university, maybe to a chess club, or whatever you want. Whereas on the Catholic view, there is this authority, this structure in the family itself, which is independent of society, which can't be taken away, so that the state has no power to redefine what a family is. It can't take away the authority of the parents to teach the children, for example. So that's one very important consequence of recognizing that societies are agglomerations of families. One important consequence is that the right to teach doesn't belong to the state. Whereas many people think that, oh, the state has the right to teach our children, but sometimes it graciously allows parents to do so. Now, the parents have the right to teach the children, and they sometimes may, if they want to, call upon the state for help. So that's one consequence. Another consequence would be that it would be fitting for the preeminence of the family over the state to be manifested in some way in the constitutional arrangements in a given society. So I think that some elements of hereditary power are a very good thing, because that manifests the family in a very visible way. Um, another consequence we argue in the book is that property transfers within the family are not properly the concern of the state, and so taxing transfers within the family is something that's illegitimate. So we argue that inheritance tax was an illegitimate kind of tax, because it's simply a transfer of property within a family. So do you want me to move on to the question of property more general, or do you want to come
sure.
back?
Mm-hmm.
So just as I said, that the social contract theory leads to the view, I think, that all authority is in the state, and then it's delegated to various other organs. So very similar to that would be the idea that the right to own property, or an example of that would be the idea that the right to own property pertains in the first instance to the state. The state is the principal owner of property, and it's got some kind of duty to distribute its property justly among the peoples. I think that's what lies behind John Rawls's political philosophy. But we certainly don't agree with that. In fact, I think that's the essence of socialism, is the idea that the state is the proper owner of all things. So the Catholic view is that there is a universal destination of goods. So God created all things for the welfare of the human race. That's the fundamental principle. Then another principle is that private property is a good thing. It's not a necessary evil. It's not something to be minimized in favor of public ownership as far as possible. No, it's something that's in conformity with human nature. It leads people to work better. It leads people to live together more harmoniously. It leads to as Aristotle said, it leads to the chances for the exercise of liberality when people have their own property. So for all these reasons, it's a very good thing. And the foundation of property is labor. By improving the goods of the earth, people gain a right to benefit from them. But nevertheless, the property rights are not absolute rights, because the fundamental principle of the universal destination of goods remains in place. So once somebody has enough for themselves, for himself and for his dependents, if he's got any dependents, then he's got a moral duty to dispose of his surplus property, not necessarily by giving it away free. He can do that, but it may be more socially advantageous for him to allow someone to make use of his surplus property, and maybe for a consideration, as when someone with surplus land allows someone to farm his land in return for some rent. So that's the shortish answer to the scope of property rights.
Sure. So, do you think it's possible that the state might at some point, right, have to enforce that moral duty? So suppose like you have a society with really grotesque, let's say, income inequality, or, one group is living in total poverty and another group is just extremely wealthy. Do you think the government could enforce that moral duty?
Sorry, Sean, you broke up slightly there. Could you repeat the question?
So do you think the government could enforce the moral duty, right, for let's say someone who has a surplus of property, to give it up to someone who's more needy? So suppose like we have a society with a really bad case of income inequality, something like that.
Yes, well, we argue that is not a duty that can actually be enforced. So there we're following the teaching of the popes in their major social encyclicals, especially Pius XI and Leo XIII, who describe that duty as a moral duty that cannot be legally enforced. And the thinking behind that is, for it to be legally enforced, the state would, in fact, be declaring itself the owner of those goods, in order then to redistribute them to the needy. So it can't be directly enforced, but we argue that it can be encouraged. So, for example, that idle land or idle property could be taxed at a higher rate, and that would be a legitimate way of encouraging the surplus property to be put to use.
Right. So just not going out and seizing it. Right.
Right.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so now we're getting to the last few questions. Just really quick. Does integralism entail monarchy? Yes or no?
No, it doesn't, no.
Okay, good. Well, I don't know. It depends on what your take on monarchy is. All right, first objection. Shouldn't we, so isn't this position too controversial, right, for establishing a social order? Shouldn't we go for something like a Rawlsian veil of ignorance or something more neutral? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for as long as you cannot have, for as long as you don't have any possibility of a Catholic society, then obviously you have to aim at something else. It seems to me the Rawlsian moment is passing, though, really. The idea that no view of the good should be enforced or should be favored, which is really the essence of Rawls' position, I think, seems to be passing, and new orthodoxies are being enforced more and more. Mm-hmm. So if you try and stand for Parliament in Britain and maintain that homosexuality, say, should be recriminalized, or that abortionists should be put in prison, then well, you're going to meet with an awful lot of hostility, and you may well be not allowed to speak in public. So that's what I mean when I say that the Rawlsian movement seems to be rather passing. But as a general theory of political philosophies, I would say if you can see the truth, then why would you want to put a veil of ignorance over your eyes?
Yeah.
So it brings us back to the original question about whether or not the Catholic faith can be known to be true.
All right, next question. Some might have the immediate impulse, right, that this is Catholic fascism. And I don't know what they mean by that, but, it's kind of a derogatory term, a pejorative term, right? What would you say in response to someone who accuses you of advocating Catholic fascism?
Well, I think fascism was probably a kind of secular caricature of the Catholic Church. I have sort of no interest in fascist literature, so I'm only going by sort of very general ideas. But it seems to me that their ideal was that the glory of the temporal society should become is a summum bonum to which everything else should be directed, especially military glory. This is the highest good, and obviously that's not the Catholic view. I call it a caricature because what it keeps from Catholicism is the idea that the individual human being and his liberty is not the very highest good. It keeps from Catholicism the idea that the human being is subordinated to some greater good, but it entirely rejects the idea that what he's subordinated to is the supernatural society of the city of God, blossoming into the heavenly city in which God is seen. So it makes the earthly city as the good to which man is entirely subordinate in all his powers and actions, and that's completely incompatible with Catholic faith, which is why Pius XI at the time rejected fascism.
All right, and now to the last question, or last two questions, right? So one is, what is your assessment on the current state of Western civilization, or just civilization in general? And which country do you think is closest to the integralist vision?
Well, I don't have a very rosy assessment of civilization, Western civilization at the moment, as you perhaps would have guessed. It was just occurring to me before we spoke that yesterday was the feast of Saint Martha. You remember from the Gospel when Jesus wishes the tomb to be rolled away, that Saint Martha says, Lord, this is the fourth day, by now he stinketh. And we're sort of in that stage now in Western civilization. So Christendom, I would say, died in certain places in the Reformation. It died at other places at the French Revolution. And since then it's been decaying, and now we're at the stinking stage. I think there is a big problem with suppressed guilt in modern society, and I suspect that abortion has a lot to do with that, because the law of God is written on our hearts. People do know that abortion is a crime, and I think the guilt that people live with as a result of that, to some extent other things, but I think especially that, leads to two things. It leads them to be hostile to the law of God, to try to block out the law of God, and that's why in all kinds of ways natural law gets more and more trodden down by civil law, and marriage gets repudiated, and pornography gets put into the mainstream, and so on. And of course, a destructive downward spiral. Another thing that leads to, I think, is that repressed guilt then gets projected onto other people. People try to defend natural law, defend the law of God, are more and more attacked as haters, as bigots, as extremists. And this is a situation that there is no natural remedy for. The only remedy for it is the preaching of the gospel and people believing in the mercy of God. When people believe in the mercy of God, then we can begin to put an end to this terrible situation. In regard to your other question, then I don't have by any means an encyclopedic knowledge of the countries of the world. I think the Dominican Republic is one of the ones that's best at the moment in its constitution. At least I've never been there, but its constitution seems to be very good for a modern constitution. It honors the Holy Trinity. It recognizes that life begins at conception, at least the laws do, that marriage is between one man and one woman, favors church feasts, public holidays, and so on. So that's my answer to that question.
What about Singapore?
Singapore, I don't know. Tell me about Singapore.
Well, so from what I know about Singapore, I know that like it's a very disciplined society in some sense. So you can't just, spit on the sidewalk. There's a very strong sense of public morality that's enforced. I think they also recognize too, like one man, one woman. The adoption agencies are to act in accordance with that. They even say, I think in the Constitution somewhere, like, they talk about the way of nature. So there's talk of something like the natural law within the very foundation of that society. There's also a good balance between public and private relations in terms of property, especially the healthcare system. It's not just totally individualistic and market run. It's also not totally organized by the state. It's very principled, if you will.
Right. Well, I mean, those things mostly sound quite good. I mean, I don't particularly enjoy seeing people spit on the pavement, but I certainly wouldn't make it a law not to do it. Perhaps it's worth just pointing out finally that the integralist society is not meant to be an authoritarian society. Obviously every society has things that it considers acceptable and unacceptable. But I share the view of Leo XIII and of St. Thomas that it is good to have a maximum possible participation of people in electing legislators, for example, or being eligible for the legislature, provided that the more fundamental things of the Catholic faith are preserved.
All right. Thank you, Father Thomas. I've really enjoyed this interview and conversation with you. All right.
Likewise. Thank you very much for having me on.